October. This year we're doing something really new and pretty relevant, talking about applications and ethical and effective use of AI in the fellowships application process. Um, if you were at our first session, great. This is going to build upon that. If you weren't, no worries. You don't need to have been at the first one to understand what's going to be happening here. And we do hope if you find this useful that you check out some of our other sessions that are coming up. Next week, we'll be talking about organization, how to use AI to help organize your thoughts. Beyond that, we'll be talking about editing, how to help get some help from AI in revision and editing. And then finally, how to use AI to help prep for interviews, which are all part of the process. And what we found is a lot of this content's also been terribly useful and applicable to non-fellowships contexts as well, particularly as we think about how to ethically use generative AI in academic settings. Welcome. My name is Kyle Mox. I'm Associate Dean for National Scholarships and Director of the Office of National Scholarships Advisement. And joining me today are Shay Masterson, Program Manager for Outreach and Inclusion, and Katie Salgado, Program Manager for Global Awards. To get us started today, and you were warned, this is a slightly participatory webinar. We're curious if you could throw in the chat your answer A, B, C, or D. How do you usually start the writing process for a personal statement? Is that through free writing, outlining, talking it out loud by yourself or with friends, or just sitting there staring at a blank page for an hour? B then C, I like that. All right, our other participants are a little recalcitrant here. There we go, a little outline, basics of what goes, yeah. So maybe a little bit of hybrid there. When, if ever, have any of us used AI to help us brainstorm? And what attempts have been made there? I mean, we'll go into this. That's the point of today's presentation. But I'm just kind of curious about baseline. Any attempts? And what I have found is most people are really hesitant to admit that they use AI at all because they're worried about being ostracized or maybe singled out. So, well, good. Keep that thought in mind. If you haven't thought of a way to articulate it yet, maybe you're curious about learning. This is a no judgment zone, absolutely. We're all trying to figure this out. Instructors are trying to figure this out. Scholarship foundations are trying to figure this out. They all have various policies, but AI, universities, and students, right? But yeah, absolutely. Yeah, ask for creative ways to integrate a story or connection without deviating too much from the goal of the personal statement. I think that's a pretty good jumping off point for our discussion because that's really what we want to get after. We want to think about how we can decode fellowships applications with the help of AI, and using that to apply rhetorical and ethical frameworks, right? This is a rhetorical practice. AI is very good about recognizing patterns and identifying the things that we ask it to identify. So we'll talk through that. We want it to support authentic reflective brainstorming. So as Daniela said, they get feedback and we want to see, did I address the feedback that I was given? Can you help talk me through that? And we're going to talk a little bit about, or quite a bit about, practicing what we call green zone prompting, as we frame the types of prompts that we use with AI in terms of a stoplight, a traffic light, red, yellow, green, and then start thinking about how can we actually frame our prompts in a way that keeps us in the green zone and gives us a good narrative foundation. So as I mentioned, that framework, all good as we ask it to just highlight things for us or to point out things for us or to act as a reflective conversation partner, or mirror, something like that. Not necessarily generating content for us, not crossing that boundary, still keeping our ideas our own, our words our own for the most part. But maybe in the middle of that, we're getting it to rephrase things or suggest alternatives or to help us outline things. Not necessarily unethical, but we should think cautiously about how we're using it and how we're applying what it's giving us. But if we find ourselves in the position where it's just generating text for us, write a better conclusion for me. That's where we want to stop and say, hey, I'm not prompting this the right way. This is not ethical. And more importantly, it's not effective, right? If you ask the AI to write about your life experiences, it's going to be a terribly dull essay, and is not going to accomplish the goals that you need. So, our general approach is what we call decoding the application. We break that down into several phases.
Yeah, and Kyle, I will add, we've done a couple of workshops as well where we've read personal statements written by AI and personal statements written by like first drafts of personal statements. And it's really hard to differentiate between the two because oftentimes the ideas are, still at surface level in terms of their reasons for going and the connections that they're making as well. So it's not necessarily bad to be using AI, but it's important to make sure that you have these three layers of decoding to help you get to that deeper level within your personal statement and seeing it as an opportunity to really tell your story. This is an opportunity that we don't often get in our academic writing. I was a creative writing undergraduate and I was writing about myself all the time. And yet, when I had to sit down and write my Fulbright application, I was totally lost because it is a new genre. You're working with a word maximum, you're working within all these parameters that are very, very different. So, one way you can use Gen AI to help get through and kind of figure out and orient yourself is this three layers of decoding, which we like to say, right? So looking first at the program that you're interested in and their selection criteria. So that tells us, what does the program value? Most of these scholarship programs are built, with a particular mission in mind. They were funded uh, to do a certain thing, to find certain people, right? And so the essay prompt is their version of testing those values. Now, these prompts are written by people, so prompts themselves are not perfect. That's something to also keep in mind. There's a lot of times where, as fellowship advisors, we will read prompts and we're like, well, I don't know if they're going to get what they think they're going to get out of it, right? But knowing that the prompts, even if they're imperfect, they're trying to test that selection criteria that they've set. And what our job is when we sit down to write a personal statement is thinking about our experiences and how we can embody these particular values that we're trying to align with the scholarship program, right? So if the scholarship program is Truman and they're looking for leaders, we're going to have to think about all of these different experiences that have tested our leadership in one way or another. Sometimes it's not a quote unquote traditional leadership experience like a student body president, but something that you've tackled in your community or in a lab group or something more local. So we like to look at the three layers as a way to just look at the rhetorical situation. And we also know that they're not checklists, right? What is the institution, what is the scholarship program actually looking for? And that's a good starting point. So we can use AI to look at the possible evidence of the criteria. So AI is great for looking at patterns in particular. If you ask, what's happening here? What patterns do you see? It's great at pulling out language, right? For like what language, what patterns across verbs do you see? Themes, etc. Those are great ways to get oriented in a scholarship's criteria, particularly. So the Marshall Scholarship is one of the postgraduate scholarships that we work with to study in the UK. So this is a great example, right? The official criteria on the left-hand column is academic merit, leadership potential, and ambassadorial potentials, which are pretty big categories if we're being honest. If we're looking, to the right, second column, what value or behavior might embody that? Academic merit, it's not just about good grades, although they will look at GPA trends. They might be interested in understanding your intellectual curiosity, right? If you have multiple majors or a couple of minors, any kind of interdisciplinary thinking, which is very ASU. Most of the students we work with have a lot of different fields of studies and interests. So they want to know, how does that fit in? Why would you apply to a program in the UK when there are lots of programs in the US that you could apply for and do pretty well in, right? And so you can use these as funnels in a way. And, if you want to take a photo of this or start your own spreadsheet. This is a great thing to even for job applications. If you see an official criteria that you see on LinkedIn or something like that, you can start with the official criteria, underlining value or behavior, and then possible evidence or experience. And you might find that there's a lot of crossover there as well. But part of the application process is also being strategic. What can only you say in a personal statement? And then what else can be said, let's say, by a letter of recommendation or your CV that gets to these things, right? And so a lot of times when we look at personal statements, sometimes we'll say, hey, this sounds a lot like your resume. So what's different between your resume and your personal statement? And that's really what we're trying to sort out here in these initial stages as well. If you want to use AI to decode the criteria, green zone is where you want to stay reflective and analytical. AI is not doing interpretation in terms of what's most important. Only you can really understand and determine what's the most important. So, one example you might prompt the AI would be here are the selection criteria for the Marshall Scholarship, right? Listing these things. What kinds of verbs or actions appear in these criteria, and what does it tell me about what matters to the readers? Again, this is asking AI to say, what patterns do you notice? What's the language that we're seeing here? Here's my CV. If you have a copy of your CV or even just a section of your CV, you might ask which of my experiences align with these values, even just asking it one to one. That can be a really great way to start off and just see what could it pull out? What do I want to actually talk about in something like a personal statement, which will likely require me to tell an anecdote or something that's not already present in my CV, right? AI won't be able to really create that or pull that out of the blue for you. Yellow zone is where it gets a little bit trickier. Typically, what makes it a yellow zone prompt is when it's more interpretive. So, for example, asking Gen AI to rank the criteria from most to least important. Ultimately, only you can choose that. And that's also what makes your application strong. It's how you interpret something like a personal statement prompt. The other really interesting thing about personal statement prompts, in my experience, especially if they're multiple tiered, maybe they ask you to answer two or three questions within a single prompt. You can answer those in any order that you wish. You don't have to answer the first question, second question, third question in order. And a lot of times AI is very literal, so it will try and work within those parameters. Again, this is just an example of how human thinking and being creative ultimately will conquer all because you have a lot more options than sometimes you even realize. So just know that AI is more of a microscope or a mirror, as we mentioned in our last webinar, that it's really good at saying, hey, what's happening here? But you're ultimately doing the interpretation. So questions like which criteria do I fit best, etc. It's what's the most strategic topics for me to emphasize? Those are ultimately decisions that are yours to make. And then red zone, anything that's generative and outsourced, any of the thinking that's being put on the bot's hands instead of yours. Maybe you give them the CV and say, write a paragraph showing how I meet this, pick which experience best shows my leadership, write an outline for a personal statement that addresses all of the criteria. You're probably going to get mixed results just because it's a bot. It mimics language. That's one thing in my linguistics master's degree when you're looking at all the codes and stuff. AI is really, really cool. It's also very literal. It does a really good job at mimicking language and not necessarily creating language. So that's why when you're prompting it in certain ways, and if you're asking it to generate content on your behalf, you likely will be disappointed. Either that or it's just going to sound nice on the surface, but there's not going to be a lot of content there. And so feel free to also play around with it if you have access to Gen AI, and I know ASU now is making it available to students and staff, like this is a great playground before you actually start writing your personal statement and doing applications and maybe more high stakes applications. Play around with it and see what it comes up with before you actually need it, right? That's the other thing we mentioned in our last webinar. Oftentimes the pressures of deadlines for homework assignments, for submitting things like scholarship applications can pressure us into using AI in ways that we otherwise wouldn't use if we had more time. And so that's also something to keep in mind. It's like just know that AI, it can be really tempting to use when we feel like we need to create something really polished. But when you're working with ONSA, something you'll know about us is that we really aren't that concerned with polish, particularly in the initial drafts, particularly if you're working in a first, second, third draft of your personal statement because the process is one of the main rewards and benefits of actually thinking through these types of things. So if AI can help you think strategically, then that's great. But we're not necessarily looking for efficiency and polish, particularly in a first draft. So at least from that perspective, I can say personally, I don't know if Shay and Dr. Mox also have thoughts on this, but I personally would rather see a messy personal statement in a first or second draft than an AI generated one where we just have to start over because I don't know anything. So the second layer would be decoding the prompt. So if we know all about the actual scholarship criteria, then we actually go into that second layer, which is, okay, what the heck are they even asking us? Um, One thing to keep in mind when you're looking at a prompt, you might ask something along the lines of, what kind of story does this prompt invite? What does it assume that I already know or believe? And to which selection criteria does it most directly connect? So let's look at the Marshall Scholarship again because that's a good one. I feel like any prompt that talks about leadership experience is very
Mhm.
applicable across a couple of them and then even jobs and internships because a lot of people ask about that. So, Marshall Scholarship asks candidates should describe a situation in which they were working with a group of people and recognized and responded to a need for leadership. The objective is to help the committee understand the candidate's leadership conviction and drive, style, and potential rather than provide a list of achievements. So, I want to pause here and leave it up to the group. I'd love to know what are the key verbs, actions, or other code phrases that you might pull from this particular prompt that stand out to you? Feel free to drop it in the chat.
Mhm. Yeah,
Okay,
definitely.
good.
Yeah, recognized and responded. Those are very they lead you to describing action, right? And there's a narrative built in there of like there was before when I didn't recognize, there was the moment I recognized, and then there was the moment I act. So they're inviting you to tell a narrative.
Drive, style, and potential.
Yeah, and to me, that signals that they're not necessarily looking for accomplishment, right? This is a leadership potential question. So a lot of applicants, their first instinct is to want to humble brag and talk about this amazing thing they did and talk about how successful it was. But that's not really what the question's asking, right? They want to know about how you approach leadership situations. And so, again, they're looking at potential as opposed to success, which is a slightly different question.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that also goes into sometimes we read a prompt and assume we have to answer it in a particular order. We assume that they're talking about a successful example of leadership. And that one is quite tricky. I think the idea of leadership style is also quite interesting. Um, Kyle, do you have any recent students that you've worked with that have
Mhm.
addressed that directly?
Yeah, and that's often where I'm pushing students is like, you're just listing the events here. What does that say about you? If I didn't know you and I read this, how would I describe your leadership style? Have you given me enough clues? Have you given me enough illustration of how you approach leadership? Because everyone does it differently, right? And so even if you don't want to put a name to it, have you shown it? Because I also think it's a little clunky to say, I'm a collaborative leader and then move on, right? Better to tell the story that illustrates you being a collaborative leader.
And with questions like this, in fellowship applications, in job interviews, in grad school applications. Um, it is very common to focus a lot on like what the situation was or what you recognized, and not so much, as Jaime pointed out, the response, like how you actually responded in that situation. Whether it ended up being uh, a successful way to respond in your, you know, perception or not, but missing those details of the what you actually did in that situation, how you approached it, as Dr. Mock said. So those are especially the kind of details that AI is never going to be able to create for. Well, they will if you ask it to create those things for you, if you prod it enough, but it will end up not being true and genuine to what you actually did in that situation, how you approached it, and therefore what that style that you're developing is.
Yeah, one of the hacks I have for questions like this is to start a sentence towards the end of the response that says, what I learned from this was, and it's surprising to me how often applicants leave that part of the story out. And that's honestly what the readers are looking for is to what self-awareness did you develop? What did you learn about yourself? What's the growth potential here? Because all of these fellowships have to do with growth, right? You wouldn't apply for them if there wasn't some opportunity to grow and develop and change. So they want to know what your capacity for that is. Are you aware of when you've grown or changed, right? And so even if it's not explicitly stated, I think it's always a great thing to finish these types of responses with.
Yeah, so let's take a look at the next slide, which is Truman. So a little bit of a shorter prompt here, but still we want to know what you're pulling from it. So they ask you, describe a recent and particularly satisfying public service activity, 1,700 characters. So how are you interpreting this question? What are some keywords that stand out?
Not as much to work with here. So, I mean, what's jumping out? Yeah, absolutely. It's an unusual phrasing, particularly satisfying, right? Is there a verb or an imperative in here that signals to you what type of essay you should be writing? Yeah, volunteering, definitely. We wouldn't want to describe a paid experience or something like that. Yeah. I mean, should this be an expository essay? Should we be offering our opinion about something? Should we be arguing? Should we be telling a story, narrative? You know, is there anything in there that signals to that to us? Mhm. Danielle is right. There should be a narrative response. What's the clue? Absolutely. Yep. Yep. So if they're asking for description and about an experience, just as in the previous one, they're signaling to you they want a narrative.
Something else I'll also add here is um, recent. So Truman has added that in most prompts that you'll receive, whether it be in a fellowship application, a job interview, a grad school application. They won't necessarily specify recent, but they are all asking for experiences that are more recent. So going back and telling them something that you did in early childhood as a Girl Scout, probably not going to be the most fitting thing for these kinds of questions and prompts.
Activity also is really interesting to me because I don't know, there's something continuous about that. They're not looking for necessarily like a one-time
Mhm.
thing. To me, I'm interpreting this as an ongoing public service reflection in some ways. Um, when I see describe, another way that might be helpful to think about this is when we're interviewing for a job position, in internship position, etc. A lot of times the way they frame it is, tell me about a time when you engaged in a recent satisfying public service activity, right? So describe and tell me about a time when both are prompting you to think about this narrative. I think the hidden trick here is like a lot of people might just say what happened. They may not get to what Kyle was mentioning about why it matters, right?
And Jaime has a great question along those lines, Katie. Should with this kind of narrative, should we begin like what happened? How did we work to make it a reality? Just talk about the activity itself, or more about what we took from it? And that word satisfying to me really triggers, it points to that last one is more they'd like to know what was it that you found so satisfying about this activity. And they could have asked that, right? Or they could have asked, why do you want to work in public service the rest of your life? Which is not a great question. This is a much better question because it forces you to tell a story that shows, why you found this satisfying.
So AI, again, we can use this to think a little bit more analytically about these kinds of prompts, particularly when we're pulling out words or what it might invite us to consider. So I really like the second bullet point, especially what kinds of thinking, analysis, storytelling, reflection does this prompt seem to invite? That might be a nice way to start take inventory of like, hey, how do I even approach this? Am I trying to argue something or am I trying to tell a really good story? What does this prompt reveal about what this program values can be another possible green zone prompt. And to which of the selection criteria does this prompt seem to test most directly? And so again, that's going from that level one to level two, bouncing back and forth between what is written on the website, what is written in this scholarship portal, and then how is this prompt trying to test it? Because then if you realize, okay, leadership, we're getting to the satisfying part, what's the most meaningful, then that can help you narrow down what kind of anecdotes you want to share with the committee. Again, yellow zone, if we're being interpretive, summarizing the prompt, for example, explaining what kind of essay structure. I mean, that's something that would be best decided by you ultimately. And of course, any kind of leadership example I should choose from this prompt, if you feed it your CV and say, tell me which leadership example I should use, it's just going to pull it out of a hat. It really has nothing to go off of, I would imagine. I would imagine also AI probably wouldn't give you just one answer. They would probably just spit out your CV in a particular order and just give you like 10 or 5 options. And then, of course, generative and outsourced, write an outline for this essay, a big no-no. Generate bullet points that would impress the committee. AI has no idea what that means in in that interpretive sense, right? They don't know what a Truman committee or Marshall committee it consists of. If you haven't prompted what the audience looks like, what they're looking for, particular criteria, it's just going to pull stuff out of a hat, right? It's going to sound good, but it may not actually be meaningful or accurate in that way.
Uh, as we move through those different zones, the question arises, what's the difference between asking the AI what a prompt means versus what you should say? And I think that's really at the core here. How do we distinguish between those two? What is the difference in terms of process there? If anyone has some ideas, feel free to post those in the chat. And the fun thing is we don't exactly have all the answers either. We're navigating this new territory just the same as you. The 2 years that ChatGPT has really been in main use has been kind of a wild west, right? Yeah, Jaime points out decoding and wanting to see what best fits the prompt versus having it write something, exactly right. If it starts putting words in your mouth or telling you what to say, then it's not really your writing anymore. It may not actually reflect your truth, as opposed to helping you comprehend what's going on or understanding what's going on. Breaking down that prompt, thinking strategically if it's one of these multi-part prompts, like Katie was saying, um, versus asking for an example of an essay that answers the prompt, right? And again, it'll write a polished, grammatically perfect, syntactically perfect, clear and concise response. But it's kind of like that lazy, dude bro that's in your philosophy class. Like he's going to do just enough to get the job done, but not necessarily go above and beyond, right? Yeah, close reading. Katie makes a good point. Um, and offering alternative ways to read, or things that are uncertain, I think is helpful as well. So as we're thinking about the layers, this graphic illustrates, as we're moving through in our brainstorming process, really we're starting with the criteria, making sure we understand those completely, making sure we decode that. When I work with applicants, particularly on these really complicated ones like the Rhodes and the Marshall and Fulbright, which either have a very long list of criteria, or in the case of Fulbright, actually don't have a published list of criteria. They have selection preferences. We want to be sure we're very clear about that because that's our audience analysis. And then we're looking through the prompt and decoding that to make sure we understand the task. And now it's time to really get into the brainstorming portion of things and thinking about how do we connect our experiences to that task, right? And decoding doesn't end with the understanding portion of things. We're moving from comprehension into application and really thinking about how can I make that connection between my experiences, my hopes and dreams and ambitions, and this reader who have been trained on what to look for in this particular, understands how to test to see if we are seeing what we want out of this applicant. So that, that writing should align with your lived experience again, which is very difficult for generative AI to articulate lived experience because it's going to resort to generalities and things like that. So again, how can we think about how to use this to connect our experiences to strategically approach this particular writing task? Our first advice, and we were laughing about this morning because this is probably the most common advice we give to applicants. Your essay is not a prose resume. Focus on illustration, not inventory. Chances are good that this application, whatever you're applying for, whether it's a job or a fellowship, asks for a resume or CV, and there's probably someplace in this application that lists all of those things. So there's no good reason to list it again, but just in prose, right? More often than not, they want to know the so what. Why did you do all of this? Why does it matter? Where does it lead? And again, thinking, this is a great way to be bouncing ideas off of the AI. What does the story reveal about how I think, act, and grow? And again, they don't expect a perfect person out of you. If you were perfect, you wouldn't need the fellowship, right? So as you're brainstorming through and as you're connecting those dots between the items on your resume or even the personal experiences that aren't on your resume, thinking, what was my motivation? Why did I choose to act here? How did I do it? What's that process there? How did I respond to a need or a call? And the impact in terms of what changed for myself and others. And that last one is probably the one, I make that comment pretty often, like, so what? What changed as a result of your actions, right? And this is particularly true with those leadership questions where, my most common responses is, well, who was following you and what changed? And a lot of times applicants are like, and we're kind of stuck because we thought of an example where we hadn't thought through those two parts of it. So as we're using the Gen AI to think through our experiences, green zone prompts are ones that are going to bounce or reflect the things that we're thinking of. So hey, here's some examples of experiences I could include. What values or motivations seem to connect them? And then you can use your better judgment to say, well, maybe I'm not saying what I think I'm saying, or well, that example might work better in this other place then if I hadn't thought about it that way. What might each of these stories reveal about how I learn, lead, and learn, or what evidence shows growth or impact rather than just involvement? Right? Helping you think through your experiences. And, in my own use, I'll just put, rough writing, just kind of stream of consciousness, free writing in there and use AI to kind of sort through like what are the trends, what are the key points here, how can I connect some of these dots as I move into the actual drafting process, which experiences align most clearly with the selection criteria I decoded earlier. So again, building off of those first two tiers to think, okay, I need to funnel down or narrow down my experiences to speak directly to these things. If you're asking it again to interpret or be strategic, that's in the middle ground, and we might want to think cautiously. Rank these experiences by strength or relevance. And again, they're just going to try to get the job done as quickly as possible and do it in a way that seems satisfactory. And so there might not be a real critical thought process behind that ranking. It might be fairly arbitrary. What story could be most strategic for this essay? I'd be willing to guess the AI is probably going to give you some pros and cons and then a recommendation, which again may or may not be arbitrary. Take that with a grain of salt. Maybe it's you're consulting a friend who isn't that good at this, right? And it gives you inspiration and like, well, I'm not sure I agree with that. That's fine. That's where that critical thinking comes into play, where the yellow zone prompt becomes more of a green zone as opposed to drifting into red. And based on these examples, which story would make the most persuasive opening for my personal statement? Again, the AI has no taste, right? If you ask it to review a movie, it's going to give you a satisfactory response. And so, as we think about how to move back to the green zone, instead of rank these experiences by strength or relevance, what values or lessons stand out across these experiences? Asking it to identify the patterns there, right? What stands out in terms of the keywords that you're using or the language patterns that you're using? Instead of what story might be most strategic, how might different stories emphasize different parts of who I am, right? And again, leaning into the words that you are using yourself to show you something you might not have noticed. Based on these examples, what story could make the most persuasive opening? Try instead what makes each of these stories feel like a strong or authentic starting point. Again, you are making the decisions. It's not doing strategic recommendations. It's not acting in an advisory capacity. It's simply acting as a filter there. Um, and obviously, I think we're all getting the gist of what's a red zone by this point, right? You say, hey, here's my leadership example, write me a paragraph that describes it. Or, hey, here's my bullet points for my resume. Can we turn that into an introductory anecdote? And I'll be honest, I've seen people do this and it's really obvious, right? Again, if you're not into the ethics of AI, fine. Let's look at the actual efficacy of this. It's not going to get to that level of nuance or connection or authenticity that these readers are hoping to see. Generate an outline for this essay that demonstrates leadership, service and impact, right? Um, Not only is it giving you advice, it's making decisions in terms of how to organize your life and your experiences, right? So there's some gray area. I don't know what the color would actually be if you mixed red, yellow, and green, but we'll call it gray. Um, there are some prompts that are gray areas. So if we look at summarize the Marshall Scholarship selection criteria in your own words, do we think this is a red, yellow, or a green? Feel free to throw your opinion in the chat. Okay, Shay, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I guess technically it would be in that yellow zone, right? Because you are asking it for it's in its own words, so there's a level of interpretation that you're posing to the bot.
Mhm.
Agreed. I would more likely prompt it to talk about the Marshall Scholarship selection words or pull the scholarship selection phrases and group them maybe across a particular section. Maybe it's within the application portal or something I've pulled from the website. Again, looking at direct words and themes across what I've pulled directly from Marshall into AI.
Yeah, I think the clue here is that question, who's doing the interpretive work? So if you're asking the AI to interpret something for you, as opposed to reframe it or explain it or notice patterns, it's getting into that territory. It's definitely yellow. I would say it's definitely yellow zone. All right, here's another one. Tell me what kind of example would best fit this prompt. This red, yellow, or green? Katie says red. Shay, what do you think? Tommy agrees.
I would concur with that.
Yeah. I would add, depending, it's a broad enough prompt where it would probably offer to write you a sample paragraph. But before it did that, it would probably talk through what types of examples could work there. So it really kind of depends. And in all honesty, if you have an account with an AI platform, it's going to learn what your preferences are and how you like to do things, right? So my own version of ChatGPT knows I like a lot of input and it's going to talk through things. It's going to analyze it in terms of pattern. And then it's going to offer me two or three different options of what it would like me to do next. If it generated content, I would say that's definitely red. If it's just giving me advice on what types of examples could work, I would put that in yellow. I think in either case, we should be cautious. Draft bullet points connecting my resume to the criteria, orange. Yes, in the orange zone. So, I mean, we're thinking here, Katie makes that one a green. Yeah, I mean, Jaime, it's getting into strategic territory. So Jaime makes a good point. He says this is a yellow, right? Um, so it's making decisions about strategically how to connect our experiences to that. For me, that verb draft gets us into red a little bit because we're asking it to generate content for us. Um, so I think the underlying premise of this prompt is excellent, right? We want to draw connections between what's on our resume and what the criteria are. But we want to be careful in terms of the action we're asking it to take and what we do with it, right? So this is, depending on how we revise this prompt, could be a green all the way through a bright red, depending on what it outputs and what we do with it. So again, not always so cut and dry, not so simple.
And just kind of going off of that, you noticed some even differences opinions of amongst us too. So it can, and we were talking about this earlier too. I think it was Katie who said one little word can of a prompt to the bot can really change what zone you're in terms of asking it to analyze or interpret or generate, right? So it's important to keep that in mind, and you'll have to do some navigating on your own. So reiterating Katie's suggestion earlier, when you're not in a deadline crunch, when you don't have the pressure of something weighing down on you that you have to get done tomorrow or the end of the week or what have you, play around with, your ASU account for ChatGPT or something like that. So you can start to see differences in what you get from the bot with different types of questions, and changing those prompts that you're asking it can be helpful. So figuring out for yourself what works and what keeps you in that green zone. And also start training your bot, like Dr. Mock said, in terms of, the things that you like to focus on, how you like to put things together, how you like to work with it. So let's put it all together. So you want to, you've broken down the criteria, the prompt, and your experiences and how they align with the criteria in the prompt. So let's look at some examples. Again, with the Marshall Scholarship. So it asks for the leadership question, and they call it their leadership question. So that's why we're listing that here. Describe a situation in which you were working with a group of people and recognized and responded to a need for leadership. I think this was the first prompt we already looked at. So that layer one is that the selection criteria, right? What of the Marshall program selection criteria does this question connect with? Not necessarily your criteria yet, but theirs. So obviously leadership potential, since it's a leadership question, but also ambassadorial. So your ability to work with others, to connect with others, to collaborate with others. I may have just answered my question for myself. But then you're looking at the prompt. So what is this prompt really asking of you? So it's the criteria it connects to, but what is it asking you to kind of prove or demonstrate? So what are times in which you've displayed your own judgment of a situation? Again, how have you worked or collaborated with others? And how have you really taken action in a situation that is asking for leadership, that needs somebody to take on that role and move things forward? So your experiences, layer 3, what kinds of experiences can lend themselves to these criteria and examples? So when you were in a group and faced a challenge, right? An independent challenge isn't necessarily going to factor into the Marshall leadership question if you were just solely dealing with this challenge. A time in which you saw what the greater need of the group was, of the community. And then to Dr. Mox's point earlier, what who were you leading that group, and what changed? What did you motivate them? How did you get them to move forward in that challenge and take some steps? So based on all of that, what are some green zone type prompts you might use with Gen AI to help you address this prompt? Feel free to throw them into the chat.
Yeah, that's the
Okay.
first one that came to mind. You know, how my experience as a supplemental instructor fit this prompt. Um, you know, if I had more time, I might write more into that prompt. But again, making sure we're mirroring, reflecting, and not necessarily asking strategy or generating content.
Another one could be starting out like on a more basic level. Which of my experiences looking at my CV um, speak to the criteria in this prompt?
Mhm.
Okay. So another big one, Fulbright, and as Dr. Mox mentioned earlier, doesn't actually have a list of their explicit criteria, but you can kind of gather it through their questions. So their flexibility and adaptability question: explain how you will adapt to working and living in a new environment in the host country, because for Fulbright, you go to another country for an academic year. So this selection criteria this prompt is really looking at the selection criteria, while not listed explicitly, about your openness to new experiences, the curiosity that you demonstrate in experiencing new things, and how you kind of approach new and also maybe challenging circumstances to show your resilience and adaptability. Of course, adaptability is in the title of the question, but some other things that you can look at in terms of selection criteria it's pointing to. Um, and then what does the prompt test? So what what is that growth potential? Most prompts, whether they're saying anything about your growth or your change or whatnot, are wanting to hear about how how this demonstrates your potential for growth. So how you've grown in the past and can continue to grow in the future. And this level of awareness you have in your own experiences that you've had. So that self-awareness. Layer 3, which experiences show those values in action. So what can we count, what kinds of experiences can we use to talk about our growth potential, to talk about our self-awareness, to show our ability to reflect? So anytime you've had significant encounters with folks from different cultures, anytime that you've faced a unexpected change in your circumstances, situation, environment, task at hand, and of course, when you're collaborating with others. Do we want to move on to the next one so we can wrap up? So, sorry, the question.
Yeah,
So, always should be looking at growth and how you want to take it to like shape and make you better. Never to brag. No, these aren't, you do need to brag a little bit. Like you do have to talk yourself up. Um, and it's okay to not like kind of apologize for anything about your own experience or lack thereof. Um, but yes, they are still looking for that growth and how you're going to change and improve in the future. So they want to see some of that already. So that's kind of the bragging part, if you will, and then how you can continue to do so.
I think my real simple formula for a question like that is a before and after, or to think, I
Mhm.
used to think, but then, and now I think, right? That's a really great way to just to frame up a how I changed sort of response.
Yep. So with Gilman, this essay is their motivations. So why do you need to have a global academic or professional experience for your future academic or career goals? And also why you selected the specific program or internship and host country. So this is another going abroad experience, but they really want to hear about your the purpose behind your abroad experience, and how engaging in a global environment maybe is not been as accessible to you, but through this global experience and global engagement, you're going to again grow in some way. So it's speaking to your own motivation for these types of experiences, for your academic and professional growth, the fit with the program, as well as, again, that self-awareness. Can you identify and reflect on your experiences in a way that show where you're at today and where you see yourself going in the future? So any experiences that show you adapting to new environments, unexpected changes, showing curiosity in a situation and not just pondering to yourself, I wonder what that means, but actually taking action and trying to fulfill that curiosity in some way, and having any moments where you've experienced that self-reflection and awareness.
So to sum up, again, I think where a lot of people go wrong in the brainstorming process is they just sit down and just start writing, which isn't bad, right? To just generate ideas or content. But if you want to make that a more effective process, particularly if you're going to employ the assistance of AI, breaking it down into these three separate thought processes, make sure I understand what are the goals of this program? What is it they're looking for in candidates? What is this particular question asking me exactly? What is the content I should provide? What is my task? And then mapping out, okay, here is my content, here are the materials I could work with. How can I best map those onto the prompt and the criteria? So again, just remember, if you're asking it to reflect, asking it to show you things, pointing out patterns, you're all good, right? If you're asking it to strategize for you, you're getting into yellow zone. It's not necessarily bad, but again, you'd really have to question how you're going to apply what it provides you, and maybe you can reframe that prompt. If you're asking it to generate things for you, that's definitely a red prompt or a red zone prompt, and you should really back up. So every time you engage with the AI, just ask who is doing the thinking, who's making the meaning, and who's deciding what matters in this particular situation. And if it's not you, you're probably at the wrong end of that continuum, right? So as you go off into your weekend, really think to yourself as you approach the next process, what's a way that I could use AI to make the brainstorming process more effective, not just more efficient, right? And I think, as Katie pointed out, probably the first thing you can do is make sure you're started early. So time pressure is not what's leveraging our decisions at that point. So again, thank you all for your time. Thank you, Katie and Shay, for contributing their perspectives as well. And I hope you all found this useful. We have found it tremendously useful to think through and talk to you all about how to best do this because there's no guidebook just yet, and we're all sorting through this. So if you found this useful, we've got a couple more sessions coming up the next 3 Fridays in a row. And again, thank you all for all your time. Have a wonderful weekend.